Israel is building a concentration camp. That is a conclusion, not simply of me or pro-Palestinian protesters, but of Ehud Olmert, who is the former Prime Minister of Israel, who was in Likud for about 3 decades. That is the right-wing political party, which is now led by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Ehud Olmert was a close ally of Ariel Sharon, the former Israeli general and defense minister, who was found responsible by an Israeli investigation for the Sabra and Shatila massacre, in which Israel's allies in Lebanon massacred up to 3,500 Palestinian refugees and Lebanese civilians in 1982. Ariel Sharon later triggered the Second Intifada in 2000 by storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem, along with around 1,000 armed Israeli soldiers and police, before becoming prime minister in 2001. Ehud Olmert became Ariel Sharon's deputy prime minister and then succeeded him as prime minister in 2006 when Sharon was incapacitated with a stroke. Olmert himself is responsible for war crimes in Gaza. Indeed, in 2009, a British lawyer predicted he would face war crimes charges if he visited the UK. That's because of war crimes committed by the Israeli military in Gaza. This is important context because it underlines that Ehud Olmert is no peacenik, no ally of the Palestinian people. Look, on one level, it's absolutely infuriating that it takes someone like this to declare Israel is building a concentration camp to get widespread or any attention at all on that basic fact. Israel has announced it will drive the entire surviving Palestinian population of Gaza into a camp built on the ruins of Rafah. Once there, nobody will be allowed to leave. That is until they are deported from Gaza, because the stated objective of the Israeli state is to empty Gaza of its entire Palestinian population. Those who refuse will be exterminated. In the words of the Israeli newspaper Israel Hayom, those outside these zones will later be identified as Hamas terrorists, providing legal justification for their elimination. That's a concentration camp by definition. That should be as much a fact as declaring the earth is round and that it revolves around the sun. Shouldn't take the say-so of a former Israeli prime minister. Alas, in the media environment we're in, that is an environment in which the media has supported, legitimized, whitewashed Israeli crimes, we have to use whatever means at our disposal to isolate and defeat those who have facilitated genocide. Now, it should be also noted that Eyal Benvenisti, the Israeli lawyer hired by the Israeli state to defend itself at the International Court of Justice against South Africa's charges of genocide, has also called this a large concentration camp, adding that is a manifest war crime and a crime against humanity. Again, as he says, it's because it's a concentration camp. Before I discuss a deeply disturbing example of atrocity denial about this concentration camp, which is exceptionally important for you to know about, I'll tell you why. Let's just listen first to this clip of Ehud Olmert on Israeli television.
אני לא יודע על מה אתם רוצים לדבר. מה שהביא אותי לכאן היום, חוץ מהחברה הנעימה שלכם, זה מה שקורה בשטחים. בשטחים, בגדה המערבית, ביהודה ושומרון, כפי שאחדים קוראים להם, כן? מתרחשים פשעי מלחמה יום-יום. יהודים רוצחים פלסטינאים, שורפים אותם.
פשעי מלחמה?
כן, פשעי מלחמה. שממשלת ישראל אחראית להם, משטרת ישראל נוכחת בהם, עוצמת את עיניה, צה"ל לא עושה את מה שהוא צריך לעשות, ומתנהלים...
רגע, שאתה אומר רוצחים, שאתה אומר רוצחים. רגע, אתה מדבר על נערי גבעות. שאתה אומר רוצחים...
נערי הזוועות.
אוקיי, שאתה מדבר על רוצחים.
כן.
איך אנחנו בתקשורת לא שומעים על רציחות?
תקרא.
לא, אני רואה כל יום.
אנחנו חד משמעית שומעים על המקרים שקורים. בינתיים פלסטינים הם אלה שרוצחים בעיקר יהודים.
לא ראיתי רציחות.
ראש הממשלה לשעבר אולמרט, בינתיים פלסטינים, אם אנחנו נסתכל על המספרים, פלסטינים הם אלה שרוצחים יהודים. זאת אמירה מאוד קשה להגיד יהודים רוצחים פלסטינים. יש מיעוט, ואתה יודע שמדובר במיעוט מאוד קיצוני, שנקלע לעימותים כאלה ואחרים.
שלא צריך להצדיק את המיעוט הזה,
ברור שלא מצדיקים את המיעוט הזה, וצריך לטפל בו ביד קשה, ולהגיד יהודים רוצחים פלסטינים, יהודים לא יכולים לנסוע בכבישי יהודה ושומרון. עכשיו כן.
זיוף, הולכת שולל והעמדת פנים שלך. אוקיי? יום נערי גבעות, נערי זוועות, מתנפלים, מאות מגורשים, פלסטינאים מגורשים, מותקפים, השדות שלהם נשרפים, הבתים שלהם נשרפים. אתמול רק בחור שהגיע בכלל אזרח אמריקאי, הוקע עם נבוט בראש ונהרג. אתה רואה, איפה אתה רואה את זה? זה יום יש את הסיפורים האלה, משטרת ישראל עומדת בצד ועוצמת עיניים.
Wow. Just wow. Here is an example of how the world has been turned on its head by Israel's propagandists, that in order to justify the depraved atrocities committed by Israel, you really do have to turn the world on its head. Note how the angry Israeli television presenters say about the West Bank that if we look at the numbers, Palestinians are the ones killing Jews. For context, of course, the West Bank is, as per international law, as ruled by the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, illegally occupied and colonized by the Israeli state, with over 700,000 Israeli settlers illegally there. There was a system of apartheid there, as adjudicated by that court and multiple NGOs. That means the settlers who are illegally there had rights, while the indigenous population living under military rule, driven repeatedly from their homes, incarcerated, tortured, deprived of basic rights. Now, in terms of deaths, in terms of killings, in 2023 alone, 2023, before the 7th of October, according to UN figures, 198 Palestinians had been killed by the Israeli state or settlers in the West Bank, 40 of whom were children. That's on top of another 38 Palestinians in that year, before the 7th of October, killed in Gaza and Israel. Now, since 7th of October, around 1,000 Palestinians since 7th of October have been killed in the West Bank by the Israeli state or by Israeli settlers, as the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud notes, with the direct complicity and indeed facilitation of the Israeli state. Meanwhile, what are the comparable figures? 40 Israelis, Israeli soldiers and those illegal settlers have been killed in that period. In terms of raw numbers, a tiny fraction of Israelis have been killed. And the dynamic is completely different because this is illegally occupied and colonized Palestinian land. And it is a state orchestrating a violent pogrom against the people who live there in support of settlers who have no right to be there. Everything that TV presenter said is just a lie, because all Israel's propagandists have are lies. Here's a specific example which underlines how little value is attached to Palestinian life. Last week, a 20-year-old Palestinian American named Saifullah Muzalet was visiting his family in the illegally occupied West Bank. He was beaten by Israeli settlers on his family's farm, and then Israeli settlers prevented ambulances from reaching him for 3 hours. He then died of his injuries in hospital. If a Jewish American was killed by Palestinian militants while visiting his relatives in Israel, all hell would break loose. It would mean fiery condemnation from President Trump. It would be splashed over newspaper front pages. It would lead news bulletins. But in this case, I doubt many even know that this has even happened. And this is the third Palestinian American teenager killed in the West Bank since 7 October. No outrage, no scandal, no one punished for their killings. Palestinian life is judged to be so cheap that even the possession of an American passport barely gives it any value. On the question of Israel's concentration camp, I just want to turn to a truly disturbing intervention by someone called Dave Rich, who is treated in Britain as a leading expert on anti-Semitism. He's a leading figure in the Community Security Trust, whose stated mission is to protect Jewish security in Britain. That in itself is an extremely laudable aim. They work closely with the government and the police, but have been condemned by, amongst others, the Jewish peace movement, NAMOD, for their vilification of Jewish opponents of Israel's genocide in Britain, alongside anti-genocide protests more broadly. Confronted with Israel openly committing to a grave war crime, openly saying it will do this grave war crime of a concentration camp, who does Dave Rich reserve his ire for? That's right, the few British politicians condemning the crime. He's written an article for the Jewish Chronicle headlined "Pro-Gaza MPs comparing Israel to Nazis brought shame on Parliament." That's because of comparisons made between the proposed concentration camp and the Nazis, made by two MPs elected on a platform opposing genocide. Here's what he said. "It's hard to think of a more pointed use of Nazi language and imagery than what two independent MPs, Iqbal Mohammed from Dewsbury and Batley and Anan Hussein of Blackburn, posted on X this week. Mohammed accused Israel of committing a Holocaust in Gaza. Hussein posted, what on the concentration camp stage, gas chambers next." How Rich chooses to describe the concentration camp is revealing and deeply disturbing. He writes, "They were responding to news reports that Israel planned to construct a humanitarian zone in Gaza to separate Palestinian civilians from Hamas, and the use of the word concentrate in one headline was all it took to open the Nazi-themed floodgates." Let me just say this. Those who engage in atrocity denial receive damning judgments from history, and rightly so. Israel is planning to concentrate the surviving Palestinian population of Gaza in a camp where they will be forbidden from leaving. Those who do not oblige will be regarded as legitimate military targets and killed. This is a concentration camp. The claim that this is a humanitarian zone is a perverse Orwellian upending of the English language. We already know how Israel interprets humanitarian, given the experience of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. In this case, after Israel imposed a total siege in Gaza from the 2nd of March, an objective and incontrovertible war crime. This Israeli-American front brought in limited amounts of often unusable aid, focused on the south, in an attempt to coerce the population to depopulating the north. The Israeli army then repeatedly massacred, and is continually doing so, hundreds of unarmed Palestinian civilians who had deliberately starved at these aid points. The UN Human Rights Office last week reported that 798 Palestinians had been killed at aid points since the end of May, more than the total number of Israeli civilians, 695, killed on 7th of October. 798 is a hideous number, but it represents only a tiny fraction of Palestinian civilians killed by Israel. This is only unarmed civilians killed at aid points in the last few weeks. These are closed military zones where only the Israel Defense Forces operate. We know from the testimonies of Palestinians they're being fired at deliberately by the Israeli army, but Palestinian testimonies are treated as worthless because they're barely considered human by Western media outlets and politicians. CNN did a detailed investigation which clearly established Israeli culpability in the first major aid massacre, consulting weapons experts about the rate of gunfire and images of bullets extracted from the victims. Israeli soldiers and officers testified to Israeli newspaper Haaretz that they had been ordered to deliberately shoot at unarmed Palestinians waiting for aid. An Israeli soldier testified to Sky News that IDF troops killed Palestinian civilians at random with orders to shoot, sometimes dependent on the mood of the commander. Deliberately shooting dead hundreds of unarmed Palestinian civilians, many of them children, as they try and collect aid for their starving families, it is difficult to think of many worse crimes than that. This is how Israel interprets the word humanitarian. It must be combined with Israel's officially stated policy, backed by Donald Trump, of entirely emptying Gaza of its people, a grave, colossal war crime. Ben Ministi's article notes Benjamin Netanyahu telling Israeli parliamentarians in May, "We are demolishing more and more of their homes. They have nowhere to return to. The only obvious result will be the desire of the Gazans to emigrate outside the Strip. Our main problem is the receiving countries." This quote, all but ignored by Western media outlets, like most statements of criminal and genocidal intent made by Israeli leaders and officials, underlines the hideous lie underpinning that other Orwellian term, voluntary migration. That is, you make the conditions of life unbearable so that the population conclude they have no choice but to flee. That is anything but a voluntary choice. This comes on top of a new piece published by the Israeli-Palestinian publication Plus 972 magazine, in which Israeli soldiers confess they are deliberately murdering unarmed Palestinian children. That was weeks after the former Israeli general and opposition leader Yair Golan, who supported Israel's genocidal onslaught throughout, denounced the Israeli military for killing babies as a hobby. This should also be combined with statements made by Israeli leaders, such as the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, declaring that Gaza will be entirely destroyed. Yet Dave Rich's big public intervention here is to denounce a few British politicians taking a stand against this obscene crime rather than the obscene crime itself. As for Nazi comparisons, if Israel's cheerleaders object to those comparisons being made, they probably should take that up with Israel and its decision to perpetrate a genocide against the Palestinian people, a genocide which is the conclusion of a consensus of genocide and Holocaust scholars, including Israeli genocide and Holocaust scholars such as Omar Bartov, Rassi Gal, Amos Goldberg, Daniel Blattman, Shmuel Lederman, as well as, for example, publicly declaring that it's going to herd the surviving population of Gaza into a concentration camp. If this wasn't Israel, if this was a state hostile to the West, there would have been a consensus about making Nazi parallels a very, very long time ago, which I know because that parallel has been routinely used in other cases. For example, when Slobodan Milosevic and the Serb army perpetrated their offensive against the people of Kosovo, a terrible crime, but not even remotely on the same scale as Gaza. And at the time, Western politicians and media outlets used Nazi comparisons like confetti. As it happens, people, including opponents of Israel's genocide, rather than using Nazi comparisons in order to cause distress to Jewish people, are actually using those comparisons much less than would be the case if it was another state. Now, finally, this isn't some random guy. The Community Security Trust plays a pivotal role in defining what anti-Semitism is, how it's understood in this country, working closely with the police and with government. And to be clear, anti-Semitism is a very real and grave evil which must be fought. There's no question about that. And there should never be a question about that. Using it to smear the few British politicians speaking out about Israel's genocide and its plan to create a concentration camp, not a humanitarian zone. Grotesque doesn't even cover it, does it? The world turned on its head. The judgment of history will be damning indeed. There's no question about that. Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in your comments. Help us take on the pro-genocide media at patreon.com/OJ74. Everything we do is down to you. Share the video. Listen to us on the podcast. Just type in OJ's podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. I'll speak to you soon.